Dr. Lutz Hachmeister, who is a writer, media historian, filmmaker, especially famous for documentaries. So it's your turn, Lutz.
I think I have a micro here. So.
Yeah.
It's okay. Thanks, Jan, for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me here in the Golden City. I was last time I was in Prague. It was 12 years ago. It was 2002. They had the biggest flood in 500 years. The whole Mala Strana was flooded, and we did a documentary on a former SS officer who was here in 1942 to 45, who afterwards, 30, 40 years later, was killed by the Red Army faction when he was then the head of the German Employers Association, so big shot in Germany, but he was killed. And that was a dark story. So now for a much more enjoyable task to give a lecture for you 12 years later here in Prague, I'm quite happy that Andrew mentioned Walter Ong, the Canadian or American historian about orality and literality. And that's my theoretical background. It's the Canadian communication theory, of course, Marshall McLuhan and James Carey and Arthur Croker and so on. And I thought perhaps I could give a lecture on how we could get a new McLuhan-esque tool for media literacy, like he wrote in the 50s. As you know, the Canadian Ministry for Education commissioned that already in the 50s, not in the 60s, as most people think, understanding media. But then I thought it would be better to go to a more grounded theme, which we are doing right now in Berlin in the Institute for Media and Communications Policy, and that's a European media database, and I called it an example perhaps for collaborative media literacy, because everyone, it's free on the internet, you can get it through the address MediaDB.eu, and everyone can collaborate at it worldwide. It's in German and English, so even a student in Taiwan can read something about Bertelsmann or The Guardian and something like that. The idea was in 2008 to launch it as an online tool to monitor the global media industry. So it's about the political economy of the media, not so much about aesthetics or creative, practical creative things, but to create a monitor about diversity, ownership, and I think it provides now the comprehensive structural data on the world's biggest media companies, and it's, as I said, it's available in German and English. Nice thing is we did 4 times. I did it with a colleague as a book. We started in 1997, and the 4th edition is that one in 2005, Who Controls the Media? And then we realized it's really useless to do it as a book. When the book is out, 2 companies have merged, or you have a completely new structure like Twitter or Facebook emerging, and in 2 years it is bigger than all the old media companies, so the internet logically was the right place and the right tool to do it. That was really successful. The book was kind of a standard reference in the German media scenes, and even companies used it to train their management personnel, but we decided to replace it completely by an online media database. And the basics of this database is a ranking of the 50's biggest media companies. We have the second half is here, but I return to the first half. And based on the annual revenues as published in financial reports, as well as our own research, several companies of those are privately owned. You can only have estimates. They don't publish their revenues and their business figures. And as you see at the first glance, there is a question of defining today what is a media company. We put Google here at the 2nd place, but you may ask where's Facebook and Amazon. So our main criteria was the advertising revenue. Google is completely to 80–90% based on advertising revenue. That's not just the case with Amazon and eBay and Facebook, but that develops. So we have a second ranking where we have this so-called knowledge and data companies. But Google, you can ask, what is Google? And that is even a central question for media literacy. Is it a media conglomerate? Is living by a new, very successful advertising model, Or is it a firm that endeavors new technologies like robotics or Google Maps and so on? So I think we have the problem here with the ranking in defining what a media company is. But as so far we stick to our old criteria, and you see the gap between the first two ones, Comcast and Google. Google have nearly 45-50 billion euro revenues, and the next one, Walt Disney, only 33, and then comes News Corp, Rupert Murdoch, 27, DirecTV, Time Warner, Viacom, and so on. And you have an interesting case on place 9, the Bertelsmann company from Germany. 15 years ago, it was the biggest media conglomerate in the world. They bought books, they bought publishing houses in the United States. They were feared as the Teutonic tortoise, the Deutsche Schildkröte in New York, and the management was coming over. And you see how quickly they got to place, to rank 9. And it can even, I don't want to insult my colleagues by Bertelsmann, but can even be that they are vanishing in 5 years totally from this scheme, that they will be divided into to many parts, a newspaper and a newspaper house, a house that prints credit cards and so on, and that this brand name Bertelsmann will no longer exist because they are too weak to compete with those Comcast, Googles, let's say Amazons and so on in this world. You see how quickly this happened. Second difficulty in this ranking is, take for instance Sony Entertainment. You have to cut off the hardware. You can't, the video recorders and the Walkmans. I don't know if they even produce Walkmans anymore, and the cameras. But this is only the revenue by the narrower media field. So, and another interesting point. You see, to be on this list, you have to have a revenue of 2.6 billion. That's the RAI, that's the last place in this ranking, the Italian state, Radio Televisione Italiana. And you see on place 45, it's Axel Springer, is the biggest German publishing house. They're publishing Bild, the European tabloid with the most circulation. And the head of Axel Springer, Matthias Döpfner, was quite famous a few months ago when he wrote an open letter to Eric Schmidt from Google, and he said in the headline of this letter, "We are afraid of Google." And 10 years ago, people would have said the head of Axel Springer, which is really powerful, even as a European publishing house, which can bring down politicians like Rupert Murdoch with his son and so on, is writing like a little child a letter to Eric Schmidt. "We are afraid of you. What can we do?" So you can see, even in a form of political economy of media literacy, how things are changing here. And if we're going back once more, you see that in this ranking there's an astonishingly strong position of BBC and ARD. BBC is on rank 20, and the BBC on rank, ARD is on rank 20, and BBC is on rank 23. That was very stable in the last year. So you see, with a huge amount of license fee, you can be very stable in the midfield of this great conglomerates, and we have to see how that will develop. So you see, it includes the companies from US, Europe, Japan, Canada, and Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa. You don't have only the ranking, but each profile consists of 10 to 15 pages of explanation. So you have the mentality of the company, you have the management structure, you have their actual goals and aims, you have their merger and acquisition strategy, so you have a complete profile. Not only data and numbers, but how is this company ticking? For instance, Bertelsmann is a very Protestantic German. They began with book printing, and they always stayed mentally in the book printing business. So they developed a very late understanding for the internet. Their boss has just been condemned to 3 years in prison for fraud. He was one who understood the internet and made billions with it, but now he's in jail, and so on. All those stories you can read on the at the database, and we, as I said, also try to figure out the role of media executives. As you look at them here, perhaps with the exception of the Sony guy, because here are all elderly white men who rule the media business, and it's quite impressive. The oldest one must be Rupert Murdoch there, and he's still around. And of course, which is highly interesting, is the role of investors and hedge funds. KKR, Kravis Kohlberg-Ravitz, is investing in ProSieben, the European television company based in Munich. Bain Capital into Clear Channel. Third Point is behind Yahoo, which is interesting. If you look at an investment tool like, or investment company like Third Point, they do everything. They also decide who will be the head of Yahoo. Marisa Mayer, who is one of the few female CEOs in this business, was brought in by Third Point. So they say, if we take over Yahoo and make a change management or try to turn around the company, then we decide who will be the head of the company. And we have Berggruen Holdings, Nicholas Berggruen, one of kind of a philanthropist. He invests heavily in Grupo Prisa in Spain and in South America, or THL into Clear Channel and iHeartMedia, which is also crucial for constructing such a database are the ties between media companies and politicians. You all know the close liaison between Eric Schmidt and Hillary Clinton, not in erotic terms, but in terms of... yeah, Eric Schmidt is notorious for things like that, but not Hillary Clinton, but in sharing common political ground. You have more interesting, the Clear Channel radio personality Glenn Beck, a very conservative but influential talk show host in the right-wing US scene. He is closely linked to Bain Capital founder Mitt Romney, who wanted to be president and didn't manage to do it. And as most of our British colleagues have in vivid memory, Rebecca Brooks and David Cameron. So this is also described in, as we could figure it out in detail in the portraits in this database. You have, of course, the media concentration through mergers and acquisitions. The most spectacular one was 2011, which isn't just closed, between Comcast and NBC Universal, forming by far the biggest media company in the world, even ousting Google at this moment. Then Comcast, NBC will have a revenue of 60 billion, near 60 billion euro. And this is the typical fusion which we had also in the times of the new economy in 2000, and an old media company like NBC Universal with films and even games and so on is merging with a larger distribution company, so that content and infrastructure, hopefully for that company, gain higher revenues. Bertelsmann bought Penguin, so they rest with their old book business, but also try to develop from Penguin Books films and so on, and you know that. And Yahoo bought Tumblr for 1.1 billion. Those are only three examples for what is happening in the business. Perhaps the most, I mentioned it, the most interesting thing is how, in which way the new data and knowledge conglomerates, as I would call them, are producing their own media content. So they become producers of their own right. Google, you know, YouTube, it's clear. Yahoo, Netflix is one of the new players. Is from, I think in a period from 4 or 5 years, it has come into the ranking of these 50 biggest media conglomerates. Amazon has Amazon Prime, or what it's called right now. They are changing their names every year for their services. Twitter is just reflecting to build an audiovisual news department, so that you have news like Sky News or something like that from Twitter. You go to Twitter and then you don't get only these tweets, but a complete news service which is produced by Twitter itself. So they want to capitalize the rapidity of the people who are participating in Twitter. You know, not only from those revolutionary developments, but also from the dead of prominent people. It's at first on Twitter. It's not in the traditional news, but you can see it on Twitter. It's a strange development that sometimes the closest relatives choose Twitter as the first medium to announce the death of a prominent people. That was in Germany when Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, one of the leading literature critics, died. The head of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung posted it on Twitter. Marcel Reich-Ranitzky has just died. He didn't use his own newspaper because he knew Twitter was too fast and other people would have posted it on Twitter. So it's perhaps a logical development for Twitter to think of an own production unit. And Microsoft is going into the same direction. At least they try. Another aspect of this database is our attempt to build a complete map of the EU in regard to the relationship between media and politics and economy. This is a very ambitious project because if you want to have a specialist on Bulgaria, for instance, it's not so easy as one thinks. So if you want to have objective information about the country and not only business reports and so on, you have to have a network in the country. So insofar with the sponsorship of George Soros and other foundations, we managed 11 country profiles online and try to have it in the next year complete. So you have the complete EU mapped in those capsules and portraits. And so you see a country profile like that. The beginning is Spain. You have some basic data, and then, for instance, the television time per capita per day, and then you have a much more lengthy, detailed portrait of the media relations and things going on in Spain. So just to give you one example which is evident, perhaps, is Greece, the case of Greece. You see the rapid decline of newspaper circulation, which isn't just a result of media evolution. You could say, okay, younger people don't buy newspapers so much in these days, but it's just a dramatic development of the economic situation. People just don't have enough money to buy a newspaper, and they have to rely on sometimes dubious internet services and blogs. Some are very good, but some are really dubious. And you had this complete shutdown of a national public broadcaster, which was unheard of in the EU before. So I think they managed to have an emergency internet program right now, the journalists there. And the result is that Greece got in the current position of Greece in the World Press Freedom Index is 99, behind Gabon and Kyrgyzstan. And in 2007 it was on position 30, which isn't very good, but it's not behind Gabon and Kyrgyzstan because reporters are frequently victims of police and violence and extremist groups. And you have not such dramatic but similar development in Spain. So you can say that all countries who are affected by this economic crisis, the Euro crisis, have very precarious media relationships. Another example of which most of you might know is the case of Hungary. Government corruption and media interference. Just one example is the Origo case. The Orban government, in concert with ISP Deutsche Telekom, who owned a website, ousted a critical editor-in-chief of the liberal news website Origo. So it's quite simple. The Orban government said to Deutsche Telekom, either you want to make business here, or this guy has to go from this website you are hosting. It's as simple as that, and Deutsche Telekom decided to have the lucrative business in Hungary and not this lone editor-in-chief on the website. And so there's the crucial question in media policy, but also has to be raised much more in a public discussion in the EU. Should we have common standards for EU members in question of media freedom and media diversity? So can a government like Hungary be a member of the EU with a policy like that, or even Italy in times of Silvio Berlusconi, which was perhaps much more severe case than Hungary? So is there any time when the European Parliament says there are some regulations and rules in this crucial aspect of human rights, and if you don't fulfill them, you get banned for a certain time? Is that possible? Is that not possible? That is a question which is raised by a database like that. And you have the neighbor here, the case of Slovakia. The business conglomerate Penta Group recently bought Slovakia's leading daily newspaper, SME, from a German imprint. I don't know what it is right now. And Penta has been aggressively buying media outlets who reported on their corrupt business practices, the so-called guerrilla affair. So they bought critical journals and then ousted the staff. And in that case, 60 journalists, Slovak journalists, have resigned by their own as a resign of protest. So it's a task of the database to be a monitor for cases like that, and then to create public awareness for developments and processes like that. And you have also to consider that you have those pan-European media conglomerates, RTL Group, for instance, which belongs to Bertelsmann, has 52 television channels and 28 radio stations in Germany, France, Belgium, and so on. Sanoma, Finnish-based media conglomerate, has 176 magazines and newspapers in Finland, Netherlands, Belgium, and Eastern Europe. And the Bauer Group, a German printing house, has more than 160 magazines in the UK, Spain, France, Poland, Romania, and so on. So you can see the reach of media conglomerates like that. Our research goals in the next years would be to expose the degree of media concentration in Europe, to make media-related power structures more transparent and accessible, and in the long run, deduce media regulatory recommendations, to be in concrete contact with EU parliamentarians, which we already have managed. There are a lot of younger EU parliamentarians who are aware of that problem, not only in this divide between Europe here and those aggressive companies from the Californian ideology. That is very simple, but even in terms of how to get common standards in the EU. And so this database is interesting, but would be not as useful if you don't have a political background to deal with, to have some pressure groups in the EU Parliament and in the Commission who are aware of this and those developments. And it's supported by Soros, by the Open Society Foundations, by the Rudolf Augstein Stiftung, which is Der Spiegel, the editors of Der Spiegel in Germany, and the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, the Federal Agency for Civic Education, and several other foundations. So to keep it updated, that's the specific of the database. You have to have a lot of money, because you have to work on it every day, and you have to have specialists for that field. And so up till now we try to, and we managed to get it on and to keep it solid and present, but that's a lot of work. And it's also, we have some very interesting solid partners in Europe, Nordicom, for instance, Pandemia, the University of Zurich, European Alternatives. So, and it's getting more and more. So you see, in terms of media literacy, if you create a practical tool like that is now focused on political economy, it can grow by managing forces of the civil society together. One has to make the start, and you have to have enough funding, but then you can manage to get through. I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And we have enough time for questions, comments, complaints, whatever. So the floor is open. By the way, how many people works in the Institute on this project?
Yeah, each of these portraits has its own author who is paid freelance. So there are 60, 70 people, but in the core 5 people who are coordinating it. And we didn't decide to go for a complete Wikipedia system. So we tried to filter it a little bit, but everyone can write to the editors, and then it's put into the system and the portraits.
Thanks. Okay, so questions? Questions, comments?
Everybody wants to have Budweiser and... okay.
Yeah, just a second, please.
Yeah.
No, I think it's better. I just wait 10 seconds. I'm running.
Thank you. Thank you for running. Hello. I think the most shocking thing for me there was the slide with the various the diversity slide, and the diversity went as far as different poses, armed crosses, and different ties. And obviously, you highlighted that, but as far as you see it, what are the answers there?
Okay, the interesting thing is, I think it doesn't differ so much from the other big conglomerates in the tech industry or in the traditional industries, but it's much more important in the media, because those guys are creating images, they are creating opinions, and so it's much more a transformation tool for their worldview. The interesting thing is, for instance, we did a special research on the foundations of those companies. They are not doing their day-to-day business, selling websites or advertising or books or something like that, but they all have foundations. Bertelsmann, for instance, the role was very critical in Germany. There are several books about that. The Bertelsmann Foundation is the biggest German foundation. They are sponsoring schools, they are sponsoring measuring education. They invented the ranking system for the German universities, which is the by far most respected ranking system, but also the most criticized. And so they are transforming their welfare state capitalism model to the whole society through their market power. And that's even more important than the everyday business that they are doing with their media products. And that's a research that has still to be done in a refined way. In America, it's much bigger. We don't know, if you think of the lobbying of Google, it's incredible. The only functioning Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin is completely financed by Google, in Berlin. Because the State University hasn't, the Freie Universität or the Humboldt University, haven't either enough money or enough energy or enough foresight to do it by themselves. So they say, okay, if Google comes and gives a few million, we name it the Alexander von Humboldt Institute. It's called exactly like the university. And it's completely funded by, nothing against Google, they are great, but it's just to say how it is.
Of course, nothing against Google. Sure. Rob?
Really great database. I'm excited about it. That sort of begs the question, what you were just saying, is there some kind of pushback from the public sphere, if you will, to quote another famous German?
Yeah.
And if so, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's if you get close to politicians with it, and get too close to a legislatory process, and we have frequent talks with the Ministry of Economics, where the Vice Chancellor of Germany now sits, Sigmar Gabriel, then they take you very seriously. So they try to telephone and say that's not right, and can we correct it? Of course they can correct it. If it's an error, we will delete it or have another a different text. But that's the crucial point. If you just do it as a project and it's a database and so on, it might affect their image. Okay. But we try to stay fairly neutral and objective and not too polemic. But if they see that with those data you get close to political decision making, then they get very aware of it, the companies.
Yeah. Okay.
So you are addressing a room full of media educators.
Yeah.
And one of the things we do is we teach children and young people and teachers about the political economy of the media. And so one thing I wonder about is, apart from marveling at the size of the numbers, and watching the jockeying take place from year to year, who's up, who's down, the so what question has some really complicated implications for how we teach future media professionals, as you do, and how others of us teach future teachers and educators. One thing that is clear that your database will do, which is it will increase people's anxiety and fear about media industry. Because this kind of centralization of power probably should promote fear. I wonder what other outcomes or possibilities you would like to see happen in the education sector, both in the context of higher education and what can be done among university faculty, and in the public education sector, about other responses besides just increasing our anxiety about media influence.
I don't know. It's not just about fear, because you have when you see those portraits of the media companies, you have their history, for instance. You can learn from it if you want. They all have started very small. There are several very family-orientated businesses like the Murdochs or the old Hearst conglomerate in the USA, and so it's just in itself, it's a fascinating history. It doesn't create fear from the beginning. There is justified fear, and there's just fear in terms of cultural criticism. That is exactly what the database doesn't do. It gives facts and figures and shows dominances and possibilities. And as you know, there is a great discussion in Europe right now about known European technology and industry politics. And we had that 20 years ago when we were facing the so-called Japanese threat. People thought we would have only Japanese cars in Europe, and that's not the case. Volkswagen is on equal terms with Toyota in producing the most cars in the world and revenue. So it's also a hint what can be done, but the database is really open. It's something which can stimulate your imagination, or you can search just for some data. It's not created as an instrument of fear for staying back from the media industry. So that would be a little bit funny, because I'm in the media industry still, and so I'm not very afraid of a thing like that. It's just to be an enlightened citizen, and everybody can, because it's open. It's not a secret knowledge which we configurate for special consulting services for the media conglomerates themselves. Everybody can look at it.
Werner?
So as someone that lives in the US, I pay a regular bill every month to Comcast to help them be at the top of the chart. I'm happy to
Congratulations.
give my $214 a month for broadband and television. How much are they finding new ways to get money from us, and how much are they taking money from each other as they move up and down the charts? How big is this sum growing over time?
Yeah, I think there is a limit to take money from the single customer, because in the distribution field, distribution of audiovisual content and content overall, there is a fierce new competition between those new companies like Netflix and the old cable companies. And if you think of satellite-based internet by Google, which they are planning, then there will be another player, and you have the telecommunications companies, the old telecommunications companies. So I think we have a new phase of mergers and acquisitions. The only the only chance to get bigger and to oust competitors out of the market is through merging. And this is the typical case with Comcast and NBC, to create a media technological super company. And this is the same battle we had in 2000, 2001. Some things really didn't work out there. I think it was Time Warner, AOL, who tried the same. You have a traditional company like Time Warner, and you have an internet service like AOL, and that failed completely. So it's not always successful, but I think we are in a phase which has similar structures right now.
Yeah.
I was wondering, one of the areas that's of particular concern to me on a selfish level is the impact of companies like Netflix controlling distribution and affecting distribution, particularly of independent filmmakers, which also affects the notion of film cultural heritage and things like that. But right now there's a big impact that Netflix is having on squeezing, basically getting people to sign up rights in perpetuity and then burying product so they can push their own. Does the database measure economic impacts of moves like that or trends in business to control things like distribution? And is it quantified in any way in the analysis within the database?
I don't think it's right now we don't have the means and the power to do it. We have to do it in a special study. We can always develop from the database special questions and then try to get a sponsor for a project, for a research project. And you're right, that's also a goal of the database, to develop, let's say, a matrix of problems in the new media and technology developments, and then try to get funding for a study which measures that. But Netflix is an interesting story. They managed to have an image like, we are House of Cards, and we do the new television, and and orange is the new black, and so on. And on the other hand, you have the effects you described, and on the other hand, there's the third effect. I know it by myself. Several of my films are on Netflix USA. You can't see them in Europe, but in USA on Netflix. And that created a new awareness and a new business model for the films. I don't get much money from Netflix, really. That goes through another distributor who sold it to Netflix. But some people come and say, could you show the film in cinemas again, and so on. So that's not the end of the story. We have to look at it, I think, a few years. And if Netflix will, there are other streaming services, as you know, how the competition goes there in that business field. I think there is.
How do you see the future of European regulation? Because you talked about the Hungarian case there, and well, there have been recommendations, and the EU said, well, Orban shouldn't do this and that, and then nothing changed actually. So how do you see, or how could it change, or will it be better or worse? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it can only be changed by the European Parliament, not by the Commission. The Commission is too keen on keep their members together, and they have other problems, and you have no European. There once was Viviane Reding was there as a commissar in the European Commission for media and media culture, and so that has vanished. You only have the digital agenda. So you see they are only keen on the broadband development and faster internet, which is good, okay, but they don't focus on that point of political economy and cultural and cultural freedom and freedom of expression. But there are a lot of younger members of the European Parliament who are very aware of those, from the internet generation, very aware of those problems, and they could form a new pressure group, bringing in legislatory processes in the European Parliament and keeping the pressure on the Commission to do something. I think that's the only chance. Except from movements in the countries itself. That could be another possibility. But that's so much intertwined with the actual status of, as the Germans would say, Realpolitik. In the most cases, the guy who is an authoritarian leader is not overthrown by the media or by mere protest, but if he gets too weak, and people are feeling that, and then it's the end of his reign. And that's more complex than you have critical newspapers, and then it can't happen. I think that would be too simple to think of that in a model like that. I think there's...
Oh, yeah. Hi, thanks. I want to follow up on Rennie's question, because I think for media educators, the idea of concentrated media power has, long been a concern. But after the Edward Snowden archive became available, our thinking has to change. And what I mean by that is that concentrated media power becomes an extension of the surveillance state. And so in this way, it's impossible to see that kind of concentration and not imagine it having very significant impacts. And the more concentrated media power is, the more there's a meshing between these operations, between these centers of power. And it's not exactly new, but I wonder if you could speak to that, because these seem to be questions that are unavoidable when we see in many countries, in North America, in my country, these things are unavoidable questions that are part of understanding what that actually means.
Yeah, you're quite right. The next step should be in the development of the database there was a book, I think, in the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s in the USA, which is called The Invisible Government, and which was about secret services, the CIA, and not in terms of Verschwörungstheorie, as the Germans would say, conspiracy theories, but just describing how powerful those agencies are and how close their relations to the media are. And I think that should be a part of the database. You're quite right. Otherwise, you would get the impression of the old impression that there are 50 media companies who rule the world, and so we have to urgently to put that element into the database. You're quite right, which is not easy. Because they are secret services. They are named secret services because they are mostly secret, and the fate of Edward Snowden. But we try.
Now, just a follow-up on this question: what do you think, and how do you see the future role of public service media? I mean, BBC and ARD was on the list. It's not so deeply involved in this power network. On the other hand, there are quite weak public service media: Greece, Hungary, Slovakia, US definitely. So how do you, at least in Europe, how do you see the future of public service media in this context?
It's very difficult because it's a bit a question of the behavior of the public services itself. Not in the US, that's a completely different situation, completely different history, but you have very strong public service institutions, even in terms of their financing in Great Britain and Germany. Germany's two public service institutions have 9 billion euro funding, which is the richest system in the world, yet they are under deep criticism because of their programming, of their products. They are saying, why don't you manage to make series like House of Cards, or even the Danish public service radio manages to do Borgen, a political thriller series. And so it's up to the, I think, if I can speak about the German case, they are very loved by the politicians. The public services is loved now by the politicians from right to left, because they are based in the regions. There's the employment is safe. It is publicly funded, and they are normally they are very nice to the politicians because they know their funding is dependent on the decision of the politicians. So you have rarely a very critical interview with Angela Merkel in German television. She's a genius in avoiding critical interviews, but besides of that, there are no journalists which I can think of in the last 3 or 4 years of any interview in ARD and ZDF which was at least a little bit critical of Angela Merkel. because they know, IRD and ZDF, that they need the support of the strong politicians to stay, not only stay alive, but to stay powerful and have 9 billion funding. So that's a critical situation. I think the BBC is a little bit more open to critical journalism, but they are also under constant political threats and under the threat of being too bureaucratic, and they have this 10 years rule of renewing the license and so on. So it differs. That's an own field for monitoring the situation. But in terms of theory, I think countries which have a strong public service system are better off in terms of democracy. That's clear.
Okay, other questions? So I can read in your eyes the increasing number of thinking about the vouchers and discounts. So
that's political economy.
Okay, so let me thank Lutz for his presentation.